Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Matthew, Lecture 8. In this chapter, Steiner moves on down to a discussion of the significance of the three temptations of Christ by Satan, and then to Christ preparing with the Sermon on the Mount, the preaching of the kingdom. But he also describes the Essenic initiation in terms of the one that led through 42 stages, but in this case, it's filtered through the terminology of the Sephirot from Kabbalah. So he borrows the terms of the 10 Sephirot as they descend downward, as they emanate from the power of God to Malkut, which is the realm of the earth, the earthly realm. And he says, before he starts this, he says, the point about the mystery of Golgotha is that in the ancient initiations, one went through the various stages, and they all had different stages and phases and temporal durations. Some had 3 days, perhaps some did not. The ego was always suppressed. So whenever you're going into these higher realms, it is with the intent to suppress the ego. In a way, it's shoved down. Whereas with the Christ event, Christ is not only democratizing the mysteries and bringing these spiritual energies down to the physical plane, what in the Kabbalah is called Malkuth, but the energies are being democratized, and they are being made available to everyone in a way in which the ego is still in place. Not the ego in its negative connotation, with its egocentrism, narcissism, greed, all the deadly sins and so forth that are associated with the extravagances of the ego, but the positive side of the ego as the sense of I am this individuality with these perceptions and with this critical faculties of judgment that I can make to evaluate myself and my orientation to the world. That sense of the ego is what we have developed in the West. And Steiner's model in retrieving all these ancient traditions is not regressive, as a lot of these models tend to be, as a lot of these New Agey models tend to be. Let's just get rid of the intellect, toss it out, and go run off with all these New Agey spiritual powers, completely skipping over the fact that humanity has evolved, that there have been stages of spiritual evolution in humanity, and that the West's invention of the ego as its primary thing, really, the transcendental self that begins with Descartes, the cogito, and goes all the way down through Kant, down to Nietzsche and Heidegger, that this is not something, this was a hard-fought process. It's not something that we're going to discard. So Steiner's whole point is that we're retaining the West's development of our sense of selfhood and individuation along with these ancient traditions, so that there's not a loss. Because in either extreme, if you go back and regress to these New Age cults, then you do away with the ego and the intellect and the self. Or if you take the path of materialism and atheism and science and throw all that stuff out, then you're just left with this silly, helpless, lonely ego that thinks reason is the only thing that matters, which is totally dead wrong. We are spiritual beings. We have come from higher planes of existence. That is a fact. So what Steiner does in this chapter is he says, now that the Essenes would have had this initiation structure, and he borrows the vocabulary of the Sephirot from Kabbalah, and the model of the Kabbalah is, of course, the energies move from above, from the divine, from God, downward. And in a sense, the Kabbalistic tree of life, it's pictured as an upside-down tree that grows and emanates the power of God down here through these various contractions that are also emanations of the 10 powers of God, these Sephirot, these spheres. So it's emanating downward, whereas in the Kundalini, which is its Eastern equivalent, it begins at the bottom, at the root base, the Muladhara, the lowest chakra, the earthly one, and then ascends upward to the crown of the head, which is called the Sahasrara, the thousand-petaled lotus, which is the union with the God through the ecstatic union of Atman with Brahman. So what Steiner does here is he does a similar sort of thing, is he looks at the model going from below upward, but also backwards in time, because for Steiner, the four components of man, the ego, the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body, were constructed chronologically over his four epochs, beginning with old Saturn, when the rudiments of the physical body were brought in, first by divine spiritual beings, and then to old Sun, when the etheric body was brought into being, and then to old Moon, when the astral body was then added, and then finally to Earth, where we have not only the phase of solidification of all of this on the material plane, but also the ego is brought in. So he says that the ego is the highest member of the human being, but it's the baby of the four because it's the youngest, and it's still kind of in a state of potentiality. It contains everything that is attainable spiritually by man, that's still there in nuke, let's say. It's there, it's latent, and we have to develop it. So it is higher than the physical body, let's say, but he says that the physical body is much older than the ego, older even than the astral or the etheric, because it's perfectly worked out over millions and millions and millions of years, billions actually, if you go all the way back to bacteria, and it has been worked out by divine spiritual beings. So if we compared, let's say, the perfection and the functioning of the physical body to the astral body, which is younger than it is and less perfect, because the astral body is the seat of all these passions and emotions and desires. It's quite a bit more imperfect than the physical body because it's more recent. And the ego is even less perfect with all of its the tendencies toward inflation and mania and greed and narcissism and all these kinds of defects of the ego that these spiritual traditions are designed to purify out. So in a way, as he ascends up the tree, he's going backward in time. The initiate would be beginning at the level of Malkut. So the tree descends from Keter, which is the crown of the head, corresponding to the Kundalini. And it's best to map this, even though it's a tree, it's an upside down tree. There's another model, which is it of the primal man, Adam Kadmon. And it's easier to remember if you map it onto the organs of the body, starting with the crown. And then the next Sephiroth that emerges is the right eye, which is Chokhmah, wisdom, and it's masculine. Surprisingly, wisdom is Sophia, usually feminine, but in this tradition, the genders are reversed. And then the left eye, which is Binah, which is female, and it's intelligence. So we have wisdom and intelligence. This is the upper three. And then it goes down to the two arms, Chesed, which is the arm that had the right hand that has to do with mercy and compassion, and the left arm, which has to do with Gevura, which has to do with justice and power. Those two are normally reversed, actually. The left hand is usually regarded as the weaker side, and the right hand as the merciless side. If you remember the scene in Spike Lee's film Do the Right Thing, where he has the guy, he's got, I think he's got hate written on the right hand and love written on the left hand as he's going back and forth, saying the history, this is the way it swings back and forth. That is normally the way it is, but the Hebrews have reversed it here. And then Tifra is in between them, which is beauty, but it's also the balance between compassion on the one hand and strength on the other, Tifra. And then we have the two legs, the right leg being Netzach, or victory, and the left leg being Hod, or fame, or glory. You could say that the right leg is the deeds of the hero, and the left leg are the epics that that Homer writes about him and makes him famous. Whereas Yesod is the fundament, it's the genitals, corresponds to the genitals, and it's the fundament. And then below that, Malkut, the final realm of sense-perceptible earthly manifestation, are the feet. So the model goes from above to below. But Steiner then starts with Malkut, and he says, this, of course, corresponds to the ego looking out upon the world. Let's say when you wake up, the ego has come out of the astral plane, and it is diverted from descending into the physical or etheric through the senses, which now orient it to the outer world. This is the realm of Malkut. But he says then, in the Essenic initiations, as taught by Jesus ben Pandira, and of course he's sort of borrowing from the Kabbalah is a much later tradition here than the Essenes, but we'll just grant him that for the sake of the experiment, which is fun anyway, to see how he combines these systems. So that Yesod, as he moves up into the three with Yesod, Netzach, and Hod, this becomes the realm of the astral. And indeed, Yesod, the sphere of Yesod, is generally associated with the astral powers, with the collective unconscious. So this is the movement of the Essenic initiate penetrating backwards into the downwards, let's say, into the astral body. And then penetrating further down into the etheric body, we come to the middle three with Tiferet, beauty, and then the two arms, Chesed and Gevura, as the realm of the etheric manifestations, and then moving further backward in time and deeper downward into the actual penetration of the physical body itself. We come then to the upper three, the Chokhmah, Binah, and Keter, which is the physical world, which is the oldest, and which the physical body itself the most perfected has been worked on the longest by the highest spiritual beings, the thrones and the dominions and the mights and so forth. These higher angelic beings have worked upon it. So he says now that this would have been the doctrine that Jesus ben Pandira got himself stoned for, teaching not only this idea, but the idea that there would be one to come, and he lives about 100 BC, so he would be preaching that once these 42 generations have been fulfilled, there will be one to come who will bring down these energies of the Sephiroth, these energies of the emanations of the divine, onto the physical plane of Malkut with the ego intact. And this being will clear the way for people to do this. So it'll be a turning event in history. And he's telling this to the other scenes, and I suppose then he's stoned. This is blasphemy. You can't do this, so they stone him. So then he says, Steiner says that, so then to the temptations then, the first temptation, the problem with the ego is that when it begins this spiritual process, it wants to become it has a self-centered selfishness where it wants to become totally independent of the external world, totally independent of the internal world. It's just this selfish thing. But the problem is you have to eat. And so the whole reason why we have sense perception, why we wake up in the morning and our senses are automatically outer directed, is because we need food. So the ego has to use the senses to perceive an outer world, to go and kill things, to eat them. And also Steiner doesn't say this, but of course to reproduce as well. That's why we have the outer senses. And so hence the first temptation of turning stones into bread. This is the first temptation that Christ overcomes with the ego intact. And the second temptation, the temptation to throw his body off the temple and see if the angels hold him up or not, is the astral temptation, Steiner says. It reminds me actually of a story. There was this Indian story that Joseph Campbell used to tell about a young initiate who has learned from his guru that everything is divine. Everything is God. Everything is Brahman. I'm Brahman. The elephant coming up the road there toward me is Brahman. And the driver at the top is telling him to get out of the way. And he's thinking to himself, should God get out of the way of God? So the elephant wraps his trunk around the kid, throws him off to the side of the road. And then he goes back to his guru and he tells him this story. And the guru says, why didn't you listen to the voice of God at the top of the elephant telling you to get out of the way? You have to live in the physical world. You can go into these spiritual traditions, but there's a tendency, and Steiner warns of them here. Jung does too in his papers on the individuation process. Inflation and deflation are the normal side effects of the first stages of entry into these processes, whether it's Jung's individuation process or whether it's the initiations into these esoteric traditions. The ego gets inflated and thinks it has all this power. So now we move to the third temptation. Power over everything. I know all these terms. I can recite the Kabbalah and the Kundalini Yoga. Wow, how much power do I have? That's inflation. And that's what the third temptation is, of course, that Christ then overcomes. So once he has withstood all three of these temptations, he has now withstood the test of a high God being in a body, bringing down the ego of the Christ being, but also stabilizing the human ego on the physical plane to pave the pathway now for everyone else to do this. So then he proceeds to go up to the mountain and preach the kingdom, the Sermon on the Mount, which Steiner ends this chapter with. He'll get into the specifics of it next time, where the first line that Christ says are, blessed are they who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. And here's the kingdom. This is Malkut, the physical realm with the kingdom of the higher Sephirotic energies brought down to this world with the ego in place, not gotten rid of, as in the Indian traditions. And this is one of the things that people don't realize when they start playing around with yoga and Indian traditions, is that those traditions are designed to shatter the ego, to get rid of it. The ego is a non-entity in the East. It's not something it's not a stable, fixed thing. It's more like one of those balls that you hang on a Christmas tree that are made out of, I don't know what it is, some sort of brittle metal, and you tap on it and it shatters. That's the Indian itself. It's very easy to shatter it by flooding it with spiritual energies. The ego in the West is more like a billiard ball, on the other hand. Crack on that thing. It's not going to go. It's pretty firmly lodged in place as a result of thousands of years of the development of this thing. And so it's not going to fit easily using Eastern systems to dismantle and dissolve it. That's the importance of Steiner is taking the ego into account, taking the development and the history of the West into account, and showing how spirituality can still work, but it has to be with the ego in place. The sense of the individual is the West's great contribution to world history here. And that's why Steiner is important. He recognizes the East. He borrows terminology from the East, but he rejects the idea of the disintegration of the self in these Eastern traditions as a non-entity. As the phrase goes from the Upanishads, like a salt doll going back into the ocean and just dissolving. That's not the ego in the West. It doesn't work that way. So we'll leave it here with lecture number 8.